For regular people who might be tuning into this, I've asked a simple question. Two people have different stories. I'm asking the Premier what her opinion is on which one of them is telling the truth, so I'll ask her again. The Deputy of Health says that the Premier's office is intimately involved. The Deputy of the Premier says I wasn't. One of them is not telling the truth. Can the Premier advise this committee who she thinks is telling the truth?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Well, I'm not going to offer opinions to this House. What I will do instead is offer the facts, which I have done a number of times. I think that if people have tuned in based on the members' questions, I'm sure many of them have tuned out, and I do hope.
At the BC Legislature with my colleague Rob Shaw, the chamber is dark, well, metaphorically speaking anyway, for the next little while. The legislature's adjourned for the spring, but lots of news on the BC political file, and Rob, I'm going to take my hat off to you for the initiative reporting story of the week. You got your hands on some FOI material from the RCMP, and it told a fascinating story about those firings in the health ministry a few years ago. What did you learn?
Yeah, FOIs, Vaughn, are kind of hit and miss. Sometimes you get nothing in them, and sometimes, like in this one, you get a nice long paper trail that tells a bit of a story. And in this case, we've been hearing now for the better part of almost 3 years about 8 health researchers who were fired from the government who were believed to be, because government kept saying it, under police investigation. Well, once you look at the RCMP's records, you realize there never was a police investigation, mainly because the province never gave the RCMP any of the reports or evidence or proof that they said that they had, and instead the province was walking back all these firings, hiring people back, apologizing, settling lawsuits. But this cloud of the police investigation remained over them, and no one in the government really, until earlier this year, came out and said, we don't really expect a police investigation anymore. And so people had to live with that. One researcher, as we know from talking about this before, one researcher took his own life after losing his job and being insinuated to be under police investigation. So it's been a very damning file for the government, and it does make them look like they were being disingenuous about whether or not police were investigating this for almost 3 years.
Yeah, what it really looks like to me, Rob, just from having followed this thing all along, is that in a way they were using the claimed investigation by the police as cover for saying as little as possible. First of all, for justifying the firings. And then when all those people who were fired started suing the government for wrongful dismissal, and the government had to settle out of court with them, the government all along is pretending, because it really was a pretense, that they had handed all this information to the police. You know, you go back to that launch. We've got the minister's speech from the first day of the firings, the deputy minister's briefing notes, and you read what they have. They're saying we've got evidence of breach of trust, contract breaches, irregularities, breach of public confidence, all this stuff. It's all there. So the police then, when you read the police's record, what you get the police saying is, yeah, we met with them, and they promised to get us this evidence one of these days, and they never have. And that what happened 5 times the police met with the government and said, okay, where's your evidence? They never got the evidence. The Liberals claimed, Rob, at the outset of this, that they had evidence of serious wrongdoing by these people. They've never given it to the police, never shared it to the public. Where the hell is it?
The RCMP look like they've been used basically for political cover for the better part of a couple of years here. The government used to argue that it couldn't release documents under FOI because they would jeopardize a police investigation, but that didn't exist. There was all sorts of ways the government was able to use this idea of a police probe to keep the public from fully understanding what's happened. It is continuing now with the Comptroller General's report, which has been given to the police because they asked for it. We already know from the records that there appears to be nothing criminal in that Comptroller General's report. The police have already been briefed basically on it. And yet, when you ask the government for a copy of the report, as of this week, they will tell you, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that because we don't want to jeopardize the RCMP review, which does not exist.
And the last irony on this is the government right now is under fire on a different matter for allegations that it has been destroying emails that were asked for. We see in this story, Rob, what a good email trail can tell you in terms of a story. And this is the RCMP, and it's federal legislation, but I'm sure there are people in the government that wish they could have gotten their hands on those emails that you obtained and deleted those as well.
I'm sure some genius in the provincial government would have labeled such records as transitory,
Transitory,
and made sure
yeah.
they were never ever released. But the federal government and its Access to Information Act gave us a bit of a story this week.
And I think the RCMP probably happy they had those out. The police are probably never happy if they're being used to provide political cover for governments. In this case, that's how it looks. So,
You've got a building full of lawyers, that are just waiting to have questions asked of them, and a very simple one in this instance, when you have besmirched the reputation of 7 individuals, you have alleged an RCMP investigation is underway, certainly you would have received or sought legal advice. So, as the Premier has at her disposal the head of the Public Service, can I ask her why it was that when we're tarnishing the reputations, affecting the lives of 7 individuals, regrettably, Rod McIsaac, in a moment of despair, took his own life, why wouldn't the Government of British Columbia sought legal advice on whether or not these were wrongful dismissals? We now know that they were not. Most of the individuals in question, Mr. Hart, Mr. McClure, have been returned to their positions. Mr. Matson has been given an apology. He decided, I don't want anything to do with you people. I'm going to retire. 2 cases remain before the courts, and 2 individuals have had apologies but have not been reinstated to their positions. So I think the issue here, and it's through you to the Premier, is why would the people of British Columbia have any comfort at all that senior officials in government, these are powerful people, Honourable Speaker, deputy ministers, premiers, cabinet ministers, why in the world would they have taken action without seeking even limited legal advice on whether or not they were on the right track?
Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, of course, I want to, again, Ms. McNeil's report was a very thoughtful and incisive report. It was very helpful. And of course, it was very balanced. And we have been implementing or acting based on the recommendations she offered in that report. And the member points out that processes were not properly followed. That is, he's quite right about that. Ms. McNeil said that in her report. I accept her comments about that, and we are acting to make sure that we address the issues that she raised with respect to process.
Member.
Well, thank you, Honourable Chair. And again, I hope that the Premier will listen carefully to the questions that I'm asking of her. I appreciate that she has talking points. She has a binder full of quotations that she's able to stand up and read back. But this is the beauty of this process. And for those watching in the gallery and those watching at home, this is an opportunity to demonstrate that you have a genuine understanding of the files that are before the people of British Columbia, that you have a genuine understanding of how to respond to issues that are absolutely grotesque. And in this instance, we had government officials, particularly in the Public Affairs Bureau or the government communications branches, issuing a press release after leaking information to one news source, putting in a press release that an RCMP investigation was underway. And we now know, based on the non-redacted Appendix D to Ms. McNeil's report, that counsel, the Attorney General, recommended against making any reference whatsoever to the RCMP because, in fact, there was no RCMP investigation underway. So through you, Honourable Chair, to the Premier, why would it be now, months after receiving this report, that there has been no acknowledgement that a clutch of people in the Premier's office made a decision to fire 7 individuals, to besmirch them, to wreck their lives, and they had advice that said, do not talk about the RCMP, but they did it anyway?
Premier.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, the truth is, Ms. McNeil found that there were serious breaches of policy, that the public service did not respond appropriately to the allegations of misconduct, and that we need to be able to make sure that we do that better, as was the recommendation that she made. The decision-making process didn't follow the model that public service has for investigations into allegations for serious misconduct, and didn't follow best practices for those investigations, things that the member has pointed out. And I agree with that. That's why we've taken her report and intend to make sure that we will learn from it, that we will change the way that the public service works. We thank her very much for that report.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Can the Premier confirm that public affairs officials who, one of which was working in her office at the time, issued a press statement saying that there was an RCMP investigation underway, even though the Attorney General's ministry advised against it.
Premier.
I can confirm that the press release the member refers to was issued, although I don't believe it was issued from my office.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Again, the Premier is the head of the Executive Council. Ministers report to her. Deputy ministers report to the person sitting on her immediate right, who also happens to be the head of the public service. We had a public shaming of 7 public officials. It is inconceivable to me. It's based on my personal experience. It's inconceivable, I believe, to most British Columbians that such an activity could take place without senior officials putting their hands on it. And with respect to the specific question I just asked, Honourable Chair, does the Premier understand that her public servants allowed a press release to be issued contrary to the wishes of the Attorney General's ministry because it referred to an RCMP investigation that was not underway?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, if advice was provided, I certainly can't share that with the House today. But I will say this, that certainly the member is correct that the press release did go out. And again, I want to reiterate the fact that on the government side of the House, I personally have apologized, as the Minister of Health, very much regret what happened, and are taking every step we can to make sure that we address it. That's why we asked Ms. McNeil to look into the issues at hand, come back with her report, and she pointed out some very serious issues with respect to due process. We're grateful for the work that she did because it allows us to be able to take steps forward and try and address the problems that she pointed out so it doesn't happen again.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm going to get back on this line of questioning, but I just want to seize upon a comment that the Premier just made. She said that she apologized. Did she contact Linda Kayfish and speak to her directly? Did she contact the individuals in question, Dave Scott, Ramsey Hamdy, Bob Hart, Malcolm McClure, Ron Matson, and Rebecca Warburton, or did she just stand up and say, hey, I'm sorry, and then sit back down again?
Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the member knows the context of my apology. It was issued on behalf of the government in this chamber, and I know the Minister of Health contacted some of the individuals affected directly as well.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. And again, I'd like to go back to the Premier on the context. Perhaps she can refresh my memory. What was the context of that apology? Did it include the individuals that I just named?
Premier.
If the member can't recall, I'm not going to add to it.
Member.
Well, fine with me, Honourable Speaker. If the Premier can't remember who she was apologizing to when she made the apology, that's her business. Let's go back to the RCMP investigation. We've been canvassing this issue for some time. It's a critically serious point, in my view, of how government asserts its power as employer and as, in many instances, there are people in British Columbia who don't like governments. They're fearful of large entities that are unaccountable. And this whole sordid affair reinforces that lack of accountability. When a government, senior individuals in a government, can destroy lives on a whim and then not be accountable for it, it's little wonder that the public has a lack of confidence in our public institutions. So I'd like to go back to the RCMP investigation. The Premier, although this isn't apparent to those watching at home, is surrounded by officials that were working in her office at the time, who were absolutely critically aware, based on Freedom of Information requests that we have tabled. Meetings have taken place with senior officials on this subject. Could the Premier tell the people of British Columbia today why it is that she allowed a press release to be issued with the full support of the people that are surrounding her right now that besmirched and smeared public servants that were just doing their job, trying to make people's lives better? Pure, raw health research, not spin, not press releases, not self-promotion, but actually trying to help people by making sure that appropriate drugs were tested, appropriate drugs were approved, and that public health was satisfied. That's a simple question. Why did you smear them? Why did you not recant when you made this apology that you now don't want to talk about?
Premier.
Thank you, and I have spoken about the apology quite a few times, and on behalf of the government. And I will say this is a very serious issue. The member is right about that. And what Ms. McNeil reported for us told us exactly how serious it was, offered us a path to make sure that we could try and address the process issues that she identified, and we intend to do that. But as the member talks about lives that have been destroyed and how important it is for government to stand up for people, he should think about the lives that were destroyed while he was advising a government that had record unemployment, lowest private sector investment in the country, that sent our province into a debt spiral that took us years and years to get out of. Those people who had to leave our province because they couldn't find work, whose lives and livelihoods were destroyed by New Democrat decisions, those people had their lives destroyed. And so the member should get up and perhaps think about what he says, because those policies, perhaps some of them the direct result of his advice and his actions, affected thousands and thousands of British Columbians. Hopefully most of them have found a way to come back. But when you talk about destroying lives, there was a decade in British Columbia when so many thousands of people found their lives irreparably damaged by work that he did.
Member.
Well, thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the Premier's wanting to blame everyone else for something that happened in a land far, far away. But what we're doing today, I'm sure you'll be reminding us as the afternoon progresses, is we're dealing with the decisions of the Government of British Columbia today. The decisions and the policy thrust of the Government of British Columbia today. Not some magical time in the past that the Premier has conjured up as a defence. It's quite startling that it only took 15 minutes before she got to hyperbolic stage 3. But I'd like to come back, if I could, Honourable Chair, to the question at hand. Advice was given by the Attorney General's Ministry, as I've said, a building full of lawyers, capable people all. That advice was, do not make reference to an RCMP investigation that is not going on, and it happened anyway. So my question, through you, Honourable Chair, back to the Premier on the question that's before us in the legislature today, not 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago, but why is it that the government did what the Attorney General told them not to do?
Premier.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, I've already responded to that question. But with respect to the land far away, I noticed that the member wants to run far, far away from the land far, far away. Not that far in the past for many British Columbians to forget, and he's right. It is interesting that it took me 15 minutes to get on to talking about the economy. I'm not surprised that the member hasn't talked about the economy yet. He hasn't shown much appetite for it in the entire time since he's taken over and that side of the House as leader. But I am quite happy to talk about the economy and talk about those issues relating to jobs, putting people to work, family-supporting jobs, and I look forward to the member finding the time at some point, because he doesn't do it in question period, to start addressing the issues that are so critical to British Columbians in terms of jobs, the economy, their futures, and their children's futures.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Mr. Graham Whitmarsh was the Deputy Minister of Health at the time of the terminations, wrongful terminations of 7 individuals. Mr. Whitmarsh met with John Dybel, the head of the Public Service, to discuss these issues. Mr. Dybel had, in fact, been the Deputy Minister of Health at the time the allegations originally surfaced about the individuals in question and the privacy information that was the root of the challenge. So Mr. Whitmarsh says that advice was sought, and the advice was, do not proceed. Mr. Whitmarsh said that the Premier's office was intimately involved and that the Deputy of Corporate Initiatives at the time, Ms. Metsalopoulos, overrode those decisions coming from the Attorney General's Ministry and issued the release anyway. So someone's not telling the truth. Perhaps the Premier can enlighten us on just who that is.
Premier.
I just want to be clear about what Ms. McNeil said in her report. as we continue on this topic, that Mr. Dybel received a general briefing regarding the investigation. And it was well in advance of the decision to fire the Ministry of Health employees, and he, Mr. Dybel, had no role in the decision.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. I think the Premier may not have the appropriate documents in front of her. The quote that she just read is from the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Fife, not from Ms. McNeil. It references Ms. McNeil, but it's not from Ms. McNeil. So perhaps we can get the people over there to scurry through those documents and get the right piece of paper for the Premier. But someone's not telling the truth, Honourable Chair. Someone's not telling the truth, and I want to know if the Premier has an opinion on just who that might be.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The member is quite right in correcting me.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. So Mr. Whitmarsh says the following. I can see you're in a difficult, but this is a letter to Ms. McNeil in the process of her investigation. Pardon me, to Linda Terrace, who was at that time the head of the Public Service and the person that the Public Service Agency, as opposed to the head of the Public Service, and who Ms. McNeil reported to. I can see you're in a difficult position, having been directed to undertake the review. Your immediate supervisor, John Dybel, is also seriously conflicted in this matter. You and I, both individually and together, briefed John on many occasions during the course of the investigation. While his involvement was much less than your own, making reference to Ms. Terrace, he was involved in some of the key decisions and the timing of some of the key events. In addition, he was the Deputy Minister of Health at the time. Many of the actions that were the subject of the investigation happened. The original investigation never looked in depth above the executive director level. In other words, they're scapegoating at the time. That's the subtext here. That's Mr. Whitmarsh. And Mr. Fife, on behalf of Mr. Dybel, says the following. I have also been advised. He's a lawyer, mind, so he has been advised. He's not asserting. He's saying he was advised that while Mr. Dybel received a general briefing regarding the investigation, it was well in advance of the decision to fire the Ministry of Health employees, and he had no role in that decision. So Mr. Fife is, in writing to Ms. McNeil, saying that he does not know as fact, but he has been advised of one thing. Mr. Whitmarsh asserts something quite different. And I'm not bringing Mr. Fife into this. This comes down to the Deputy to the Premier and the former Deputy to Minister of Health. Someone is not telling the truth. Perhaps the Premier can advise us on just who that is.
Premier.
Thank you. Well, why not bring Mr. Fife into it? The member is quite happy to drag professional public servants' names through the mud whenever it's convenient, politically convenient for him to do so. The individuals he's spoken of today are people who have met the highest standard of public service in our government for many years. Many of them have served under NDP governments as well as BC Liberal governments. They are nonpartisan people working very hard on behalf of the public of British Columbia, and they deserve better, I think, than the character assassination the member loves to engage in for political gain.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Rod McIsaac is no longer with us. Dave Scott, Ramsey Hamby were punched out of the office. Their pictures, as recently as this week, were at the Ministry of Health head office here on Blanchard Street as undesirables, not allowed into the building, as recently as this week. Bob Hart, Malcolm McClure, Ron Matson, Rebecca Warburton, Bill Warburton. That's character assassination, Honourable Speaker. Firing people, putting out a press release saying they're under investigation by the Mounties, that's character assassination. What I'm asking for is accountability. Power has to be accountable. That's why we have a legislature. That's why we're having this discussion. Because when I raise these issues in question period, when my colleagues raise these issues in question period, we get back hyperbolic level number 7. This is an opportunity, through you, Honourable Chair, for the Premier to set the record straight. She promised to get to the bottom of it. That's what she said. She said in this legislature, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I've appointed someone who's going to report to someone who was intimately involved in the issue, and she was going to make a determination on accountability, and it didn't happen. So through you, Honourable Chair, why no accountability from power in British Columbia? That's what citizens absolutely need to know. There is an imbalance here between the 8 individuals that I'm talking about and the senior officials that are pointing at everyone else.
Premier.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, I don't want to speak specifically to this case. Parts of it are before the court, but I will say that deputy ministers are generally responsible, and the member knows this. I hope he's read the Act for personnel decisions in their ministry, including decisions of discipline or termination. As I've said a number of times, Ms. McNeil's report did clearly identify that there were serious shortcomings in the process, and she's offered advice to address that. We are taking that advice so that we can ensure that this does not happen again.
Member?
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The Deputy Minister, Mr. Whitmarsh, said that the Deputy to the Premier was intimately involved in the discussions and deliberations and decisions around the firings. The Deputy to the Premier says he was not. Someone is clearly not on the same page. I know how the Cabinet works. I know how Deputy Ministers work. I know that there is a hierarchy, and one of them is no longer here, and one of them still is. So again, someone is telling a different story than the reality would suggest, and I just wonder if the Premier could give me her sense of just what went on here.
Premier.
You have answered that question a number of times, Mr. Chair.
Member?
Thank you, Honourable Chair. According to Appendix D that I referred to, that's now, of course, this was redacted. I think it's important. Redacted, for those who don't know, it means it was whited out. The report that was going to get to the bottom of this, the report that the Premier said that she commissioned because she was so concerned about accountability, the entire section, the entire appendix, 2 pages of a chronology of who I talked to and what they said, was all whited out. So we now have, it's now a public document. It was made available to us in the opposition. And in that appendix, according to Appendix D, on September 5th and 6th, 2012, there were 4 email exchanges between the Ministry of Justice and the GPCE regarding government September 6th press release announcing the firings and the appropriateness of referencing an RCMP investigation. The Premier will recall that the final press release said that the RCMP had been contacted regarding these issues. So can the Premier explain why her former Deputy Minister responsible for government communications, Ms. Metsalopoulos, ignored that advice and issued the release anyway? Can she explain why that happened?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, with respect to the redactions, civil litigation, as the member knows, is ongoing with respect to some of the Ministry of Health firings. And so great care has been taken to make sure that there was no waiver of privilege through the McNeil review. That's something that we were required to do, and that's something that we did.
Member?
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I guess, Honourable Chair, I appreciate that there is litigation still underway, but this is an issue of, that happens, according to the chronology that was in the report that got to the bottom of it, that the Deputy Minister that reported to the Premier on communications disregarded advice with respect to naming the RCMP in a press release. Does the Premier have any concerns about staff that reported directly to her ignoring legal advice that led to besmirching the reputations and lives of individuals and in one instance led to the tragic death? Does that not concern her at all?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, the member is happy to call others on besmirching their reputations, and then quite happy to do it himself, as he regularly does for his own political advantage and gain. Ms. McNeil said in her report that there were serious procedural process issues that needed to be addressed, and we've taken the results from that report. We are addressing her concerns because our hope is exactly the same, that this kind of thing which was wrong and done badly and harmed people should never happen again.
Member.
Well, thank you, Honourable Chair. And I agree with the Premier that if we want this to not happen again, there has to be some level of accountability. If you can do what was done in this instance, if a senior political appointment can disregard legal advice because they want to get a bigger splash in the morning news, that's a problem. It's a problem for the people of British Columbia. It should be a problem for every member of this legislature. Power is a problem. Power needs accountability. That's why in our adversarial system we have a government and an opposition. My job, the job of my colleagues, is to hold the government accountable. And the government includes every component part. And in this instance, the Deputy Minister reporting to the Premier, who was responsible for communications, disregarded advice from the Attorney General and said in a press release and sent it around the world. It's on the interwebs. You can go and find the series of tubes and it will come right back to the RCMP, even though even though the recommendation was do not do that. So again, if we're seeking to get to the bottom of this, as the Premier earnestly said in her promise, the first of many promises I hope to explore today, in her promise she said she was going to get to the bottom of it. That means accountability. There is none. Ms. McNeil said, I cannot find anyone accountable because I can't compel testimony. The deputy responsible for communications reporting directly to the Premier disregarded legal advice and besmirched state individuals. Can the Premier explain how that could possibly happen on her watch?
Premier.
Thank you. And Ms. McNeil did point out that there were very serious flaws in the way this was managed. She was correct about that. And we are addressing the concerns that she's raised in the way that she suggested we address them so that we can ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Does the Premier believe that accountability is critical to citizens having respect for their public institutions?
Premier.
Thank you. I think that citizens need to know that their government is standing up for them and fighting for their interests, making sure that we are turning our minds to ensuring, this is my view of it, I know that the member differs, that we are turning our minds to making sure we grow the economy. And I know that the member differs with this too, that we are turning our minds to making sure we support an environmentally sound resource industry across the province. That we turn our minds to making sure that British Columbians have the training that they need to be first in line for the jobs that are coming in our province. That we turn our minds to keeping taxes low, to looking after our finances, and taking as little away from British Columbians as we can afford to, and still be able to share the wealth of this great province with people who are more vulnerable. Those are commitments that I take very seriously. Those are things that people expect from their government, and governments are held accountable for their decisions every 4 years. In my case, after 2 years. We presented a plan to the people of British Columbia, an economic plan, one that we'd already had done almost 2 years of full work on and begun to really deliver on. British Columbians held us accountable for the work that we've done. They re-elected the government and confirmed that they felt we were going in the right direction. That's ultimately, although there are many different ways to demonstrate accountability, ultimately, every 4 years, the biggest shareholder meeting in the province is the best way to confirm and ensure that government remains accountable, and we're doing that.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. In this instance, the subject which we are canvassing right now, the Premier said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and there is no accountability. So again, on this issue, with respect to the public officials that were besmirched and smeared, and those that made the decisions to allow that to happen, why is it there's been no accountability?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, the member, of course, isn't shy about besmirching hardworking public servants. He continues to do that. At the same time, he decries the behaviour in others. As I said, very deeply regret what happened in this case. That's why we went to ask Ms. McNeil to have a look at it, come back with recommendations, determine what went wrong, and she's done that. We take those very seriously, and we're working to make sure that we fix that. There were serious flaws in the process. We've certainly acknowledged that, and it's up to government, and the accountability of government is to make sure we accept the recommendations, act on them, and do everything that we can to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Member.
Thank you. Could the Premier advise the committee who's accountable for those flawed processes?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, I mean, ultimately, we need to act on Ms. McNeil's report, which is what we've done. She said there were serious flaws, and in acting on that, government is demonstrating that we are being held accountable for it. We asked her to do this report. We knew that it wouldn't come out. We knew it was unlikely to reveal that government had done everything perfectly, but we asked for it nonetheless because the issues that she was addressing are crucially important for our public service. Public servants deserve due process. They work hard. They serve the people of British Columbia well, and we want to ensure that their confidence in the process that they work within every day remains.
Member.
Again, Honourable Chair, through you to the Premier, The processes were flawed. Someone had to be responsible for those processes. Decisions were made within that context and no accountability. So the Premier continues to say that Ms. McNeil identified shortcomings. Absolutely, she unearthed shortcomings, but I don't see the accountability that the Premier just referred to. Individuals make up systems. Systems fail largely because of individuals and process in tandem. So through you, Honourable Chair, can the Premier demonstrate and show to me in the McNeil report where there is any accountability at all for the individuals that worked within the processes that she claimed were flawed?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, we took accountability in initiating the report, accepting the recommendations, and acting on it.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Can the Premier tell me how she's acting on those recommendations?
Premier.
Thank you. Well, the head of the Civil Service has been working very hard with the head of the Public Service Agency, ensuring that every member, every deputy minister across government understands the process for firings and termination, which is something for which they are responsible. That's named, and they're named in the Act as people being responsible for that, and ensuring that deputy ministers understand how this works, that they live up to those obligations, and that the processes are not just followed, but tightly followed across the civil service.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Ms. Terrace did a review when the former Chief of Staff to the Premier was allegedly involved in inappropriate behaviour with staff. There was a review of his behaviour. He left government, and when we asked for the documents, no documents existed. That strikes me as a fairly flawed process. We were told at that time that a review had been done. When we asked for the substance of the review, nothing was forthcoming. So the track record after that exposure to the Public Service Agency's detailed review of flawed process was that we had a second incident, this one that was before the House today, before this committee, whereby individuals that make up the process, the deputy to the Public Service Agency, the deputy responsible for the public service, and in the case of the Ministry of Health officials that were besmirched and smeared, the Deputy Minister of Health. The Deputy Minister of Health at the time says that there was intimate discussions with the Premier's office about the allegations, about how to proceed, and the Deputy to the Premier says, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. So somewhere between those two polls is likely the truth. Someone is misleading Ms. McNeil and therefore making it even more difficult to get to the bottom of it to establish accountability. So again, I pose the question to the Premier. Who's telling the truth?
Premier.
Thanks. I believe I've already answered that question a number of times.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. If the Premier did answer it, I must have missed it, and we'll have to wait till tomorrow for the blues, but perhaps you could just answer it again. Someone's not telling the truth. Who is it?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. As I said, and as I've said a number of times, we initiated the report, took accountability for the issues that happened, the things that happened, the very regrettable actions at the Ministry of Health, and have taken the recommendations of that report very seriously, and we're acting on them across government.
Member.
Well, thank you, Honourable Chair. And again, for regular people who might be tuning into this, I've asked a simple question. Two people have different stories. I'm asking the Premier what her opinion is on which one of them is telling the truth, so I'll ask her again. The Deputy of Health says that the Premier's office is intimately involved. The Deputy of the Premier says, I wasn't. One of them is not telling the truth. Can the Premier advise this committee who she thinks is telling the truth?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Well, I'm not going to offer opinions to this House. What I will do instead is offer the facts, which I have done a number of times. I think that if people have tuned in based on the members' questions, I'm sure many of them have tuned out, and I do hope that sometime in the estimates, as long as we're talking about opinion, the member and the leader opposite can give us his opinion on the motion that was moved today in the House. Maybe he can tell us, of course, this estimates, whether or not he supports the government moving ahead with Site C.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The Premier just made reference to facts, and the facts, according to Ms. McNeil, are two of the most difficult questions I considered during my review were who effectively made the decision to dismiss the individuals, what factors were considered. These questions remain unanswered. That's the fact. They remain unanswered. That's not me, Honourable Chair. That's the person that was appointed by the person, Ms. Terrace, who was involved in the firings in the first place. That was the constant content of the report. The questions remain unanswered. So it is opinion, in fact, by Ms. McNeil with respect to accountability. If the public of British Columbia is going to have confidence in their public institutions, they have to know that there is accountability when processes fail. What happened in this instance was the Premier said she was going to get to the bottom of it. A report was issued that said, I can't get to the bottom of it, and that's good enough for the Premier. So my question through you to her is, to the Premier, is quite simple. Will you reopen this issue so that the public can have some confidence that when power is abused in British Columbia, as it was in this case, in the lives of 8 individuals, power was abused, those with it went at those who did not have it, they disregarded legal advice, they made up a story about an RCMP investigation that so traumatized one individual that he took his life, and the Premier's okay with that by reading boxed answers? Accountability, Honourable Chair, through you to the Premier. Will you reopen this issue, allow Ms. McNeil or any other prominent person to compel testimony so we can find out if Mr. Whitmarsh is telling the truth or Mr. Dybel is telling the truth?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. As I've said a number of times, actually quite a number of times, we have accepted Ms. McNeil's report. We are learning from it. We have improved our processes as a result, and we are working to ensure that we respond better to any future instances that might occur, although we certainly hope that they will not.
Member.
Again, Honourable Speaker, I'll just try this one more time. The Premier's a parent. I'm a parent. Many people in this room are parents. And children understand accountability. Since I've been this big, my mom told me to be responsible. Be responsible for your actions. Take accountability. The world will be a lot better off if you just fess up. The issue involved here are 8 individuals that were just doing their jobs. They were working to find out if antipsychotic drugs were being appropriately tested to protect young people and to protect seniors. That is a function of government that I think all British Columbians would want to see more of. Protect citizens. Those individuals were tarnished because government abused power. And does the Premier, last question on this file so she can load up on the rhetoric, does she really believe that she got to the bottom of this by being able to stand up and say no one is accountable?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Well, you know, I want to reiterate, based on the members' comments, which are really, really just unbelievably inappropriate. The head of our civil service does not deserve to be called a liar in this House. He does not deserve that after 32 years in the public service and having served under social credit, NDP and BC Liberal governments, having worked for ministers at the same time that he did. He deserves better than that in this chamber, and the government has responded with great regret and a direct apology, an acknowledgement that what happened to those individuals was wrong, and an effort to make sure that we got all the information that we could to ensure that it didn't happen again and correct those processes. We are doing all of that. But in the meantime, it is not acceptable for this member, for his own personal political gain, to stand up and drag the reputations of hard-working public servants through the mud. People who have served our province with a spotless record for over 3 decades. That is not acceptable, and the member should stand up and do what the government did to the health employees and apologize.
Member.
Rod McIsaac, Dave Scott, Ramsey Hamdi, Bob Hart, Malcolm McClure, Ron McIsaac, Rebecca Warburton, Bill Warburton. They're the ones that deserve the apology in this case. Whenever there's an abuse of power, whoever does it, New Democrat, Liberal, Green, Spaceman, there needs to be accountability, and you're skirting it, and that's offensive. To me, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about another promise. We're going to talk about another promise that the Premier made. She said to me,